Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Rena Lauer, who is the Associate Professor of History and Religious Studies at Oregon State University. And the topic of this episode will be mainly focused on her book that came out a few years ago called Colonial Justice and the Jews of Venetian Crete, published by Penn University Press. And Crete, we'll get to, is an island, Greek island with the city of Candia, and we'll focus on that. So thank you very much, Professor Lauer, for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So as you said, I teach at Oregon State University, and that's in Corvallis, Oregon, a beautiful town with a surprising and lovely Jewish community. And before this, I did my PhD at Harvard. But a lot of times people ask me, why did you become a medievalist? And here I need to point to my Jewish day school education, and the fact that when we start to learn, we start to learn in Chumash classes about Rashi or about Ibn Ezra, and we use the present tense. We say, Rashi says this, or Ibn Ezra says this. And I got to high school, and suddenly I learned that these people lived at a particular time. Most of these commentators lived during the Middle Ages. I got really interested in this thing, the Middle Ages, and thinking, how did the places and the times that these people lived affect how they read Torah? And that was one of the reasons that I got into studying the Middle Ages when I got to college.
Now, I guess so the period, we'll talk about the book in a second, a little bit later. I mean, how did you get interested in Crete in general? And I guess we'll talk about this whole time period.
Sure. So first of all, I'm really interested in places that are kind of on the margins. So Jewish history usually takes place, at least in our minds, in Ashkenaz, so in German-speaking lands, or maybe France, or maybe in Spain and the Sephardic world, and then maybe in the Muslim world, if you're thinking about the Cairo Geniza. But Crete is this island in the middle of the Mediterranean, so it's about halfway between Italy and Israel, and it's a great place to stop off if you're on a boat. But it means that it's kind of in the middle of everything. And it's this place, this melting pot of cultures and melting pot of Jewish cultures. So I, like most people, knew virtually nothing about Crete. And when I was starting to do research and think about what I wanted to focus my project on, I discovered that a scholar before me had edited a volume of wills, meaning last wills and testaments. So before people die, they want to get their affairs in order. People have been doing this for a very long time, at least since the 12th century in the European world. And so I found this collection of wills from Crete. And as I'm reading through it, I suddenly found Jewish wills. So we're talking about wills written in Latin for Jews, both men and women. And I was sort of shocked. I had no idea really at this time that Jews were engaging this early. So we're talking here about 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in using these kinds of instruments, these legal instruments, these wills that were provided by secular and Christian states. So as I started finding out about Jews and these wills, I thought, Crete, Jews, what's going on there? And I started to do some research. I got myself to the archive. So for reasons that I will soon describe, Crete's archives are all in Venice. And I got to the archive and I discovered Jews were everywhere. There are Jews in court cases. There are Jews making contracts. And of course, there are Hebrew sources, these Taqqanot, the Taqqanot from Crete, Taqqanot Candia, which I'll happily talk to you about. And there was just so much material. And I realized it was a community without enough of a voice. And I was very excited to give a voice to that.
Now, you mentioned that Crete is in between Italy and kind of Israel. So maybe let's talk a little bit about Crete and about Candia, which today is Heraklion, and explain to people, the history of Crete, especially through a Jewish lens, and then its history, and you'll get to the Venice part.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you're thinking about your map of the Mediterranean, think about where Greece is. So there's the Aegean Sea with Greece on one side and the west coast of Turkey on the other. And kind of as a little gate of the Aegean on the southern border is Crete. So it's kind of sitting there. It's this very long island. And gosh, it's like the 88th biggest island in the world. It's a substantial island. It has since very ancient times been a kind of trade hub because it is splat in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's not only close to Italy and Greece and Turkey and Israel, and not all that terribly far from North Africa. So it becomes this place where anybody who's traveling anywhere by sea, which is what people did for most of history in the Mediterranean, it was a good place to stop off. It was a good place to have a base. And we know that there had been Jews on Crete for a very long time, at least since the 1st century of the Common Era. Crete had been, over time, Roman, Byzantine, Muslim, Byzantine again. And then the kind of key moment happens in the age of the Crusades. So the Crusades start in the 1090s, and the Crusades are aimed against Muslim states in the Levant, which is one of the ways that we historians call the Holy Land. Essentially what we have are Christians who are trying to take back the Holy Land. And it's successful at first, but something strange happens. First, the Crusades stop being terribly successful. The only way that they sort of remain successful is that there are crusader states in the Holy Land. So most of modern day Israel and Jordan and Syria were part of a crusader kingdom called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So there's this like Christian European stronghold in Israel. And by the time that we get to the early 13th century, the Venetians are really, really big into the Crusades, not taking over states so much, but realizing that they can make a lot of money by becoming major shippers through the Crusader states. So what happens is that in 1204, there's a new crusade being planned. It's supposed to go to Egypt. And for various reasons, it gets really, really waylaid. And basically, the Crusaders, through the suggestions of the Venetians, end up taking over the Byzantine Empire. And so we actually have this sort of weird moment of this Latin kingdom, this Catholic kingdom in Byzantium. But what's really important for us is that Venice uses this moment around 1204 to take over a bunch of islands in the Mediterranean that it had long wanted, because they would be really important port cities so that Venice can build its revenue and build its economic powerhouse status. Crete is one of them, and Crete becomes its flagship colony. So from, let's say, 1211 through 1669, so that's a long time, Venice holds Crete, and it is indeed their flagship colony. It is the most important Venetian colony, period. Does that help you understand Crete and its importance, at least through its regular secular history?
Absolutely, yes. In the secular history, yes. And we should also point out that Venice at this time was not just an interesting city in Italy. I mean, this has been mentioned a number of times. I've mentioned on the podcast, but Venice was the Republic of Venice or Kingdom of Venice. It was an actual country. So this was a big deal for Venice.
That's a really important point to make, that Venice is not just a little city on the lagoon. It is a economic, political powerhouse with tentacles controlling all sorts of ports. Even before it held those ports for real, it definitely had an enormous economic and political stronghold across the Mediterranean.
Now, the Jewish community of Crete, of Candia mainly, because there's other parts, but let's focus on Candia, which is what you
sure.
on. So I will just say this to start before we get into the actual community. For the listeners, may be familiar with the Yashar Candia. Mr. Shlomo Del Medigo wrote the Sefer Elim. There's also his somewhat relative. I don't think it was his grandfather, right? Uncle of some sort. They wrote the Bechinas Hadas, Del Medigo, and then also there's Rabbi Kapsali, who we'll talk about in the Taqqanot Candia, and there's a couple of works from him that he wrote, halachic works and history, and then there's Moshe Kapsali, who was his uncle, who was actually the chief rabbi of Constantinople.
Yes.
Or when the Turks took over. So he was before Rabbi Mizrahi, for those listening who want to know when this was. So there is real famous Jews coming out, even if people don't know of them, from Candia. So talk a little bit about the Jewish community in Candia.
Absolutely. And I'll just say before, sort of as a coda to what you've just mentioned, there's this really funny thing that happens when you go and read about these really important rabbis, really important, famous halachists and philosophers, that you go and you read their biographies, and the fact that they're from Crete is sort of not made clear. Sometimes there are errors in their biographies, and they get called Ottoman or they get called Ashkenazi when that is a very complicated kind of name for them. So absolutely. So when Crete was Byzantine, there had long been a Jewish community already then. We have evidence from the Cairo Geniza of Jews who, a lot of them were merchants and traders. And so by the time that Venice took over in, say, 1211 or so, there was an established Jewish community. And what we see is that only about 17 years later, so in 1228, the community is established and organized enough to set out its first kind of community rule, the first of the Taqqanot. So by the early 13th century, there's a really well-established community. And the community will remain through Venetian times. It will remain through Ottoman times. And unfortunately, the community is really ended for all intents and purposes in one fell swoop, in one day, when the Nazis take the rest of Crete's Jews off to concentration camps, and an Allied boat actually bombs that ship, thinking that it's an enemy ship. So nowadays there are a few Jews, and there have been some Jews who've gone back, and there's actually a shul and library in Chania, which is a town on Crete. But so Jews had this very long storied history in Crete from Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman times, all through the modern period. Right.
And like you mentioned, there's I already mentioned this, Rabbanim, and there have been famous Jews in the community. Now this community also, like you said, wasn't specifically Ashkenaz or anything. It was a mix of like Italy, I guess. There was Ashkenazim, there was Italians, probably Sephardim, and the nusach there they davened. There was the Romanio, the Byzantine nusach, right? Correct?
Yes. So
not Greek. Yeah. Sorry, Byzantine kind
of. Well, absolutely Greek. Byzantine and Greek here are synonymous. Absolutely. The vast majority of Jews in Candia and in Crete in general were Byzantine Jews. Who were called Romaniotes. So Romania is another way of saying Byzantine, that's one of the Greek ways of saying it. So these Romaniote Jews spoke Greek. That was their everyday language. And they davened in this specific Romaniote liturgy, which we have some good evidence for. One of the funny things that we know about it is that they famously read the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur in Greek, which sort of shocks people sometimes to think about that they were so comfortable with their vernacular. So yeah, absolutely. This is mostly a Romaniote community, but there are Ashkenazi Jews who come in quite early in the 13th century and continue to come in as things get worse and worse in the German-speaking lands for Jews. There are Jews from Spain who come in, especially after 1391, when things start to get really bad for Jews in Spain. And then we have Jews from all over. We have Jews from the Muslim world, from Damascus. We have Jews from all over, basically anywhere that you can imagine in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern orbit and European orbit. We have Jews who appear there.
Right. So not to throw us off track, just something I'd mentioned actually came up. I don't remember which podcast episode, but I did mention the Mizrahi was Romaniote Mizrahi. Like I mentioned, the Moshe Kapsali, who was the chief rabbi before him in Constantinople, was also a Romaniote Jew. And I believe there's a biography, Meir Ben-Yo was a biography on Rabbi Kapsali, and he does mention the Moshe Kapsali quite a bit. It was a big fight between him and the Marik in Italy. And, again, I don't want to push us off track, but just to mention, so there was, I think Goldschmidt talks about the Nusach, there was a master print of the Nusach Tefillah. So there is quite a people want to read up about it, and there has been writings from them. And it's kind of, after the Geber of Sfarad and they came to Turkey, that was kind of the end of them, essentially, they became all Sephardi.
Yeah, to some extent, this is what some scholars think of as a kind of Sephardic imperialism. that these Romaniote communities couldn't quite withstand the sense of cultural supremacy that the Sephardic Jews came with. So in some places, actually in a lot of places, Sephardic communities move in and they essentially take over. They change how people daven. They change how all of the sort of standard minhagim. They become basically Sephardic. But in a few places, and Crete is a good example of that, the Romaniote community is so strong that they withstand this Sephardic influx. And so what happens in Crete is that we don't really have we don't have a kind of Sephardic takeover. The Romaniote piece stays very strong. I will say that a lot of these Romaniote people, so Eliyahu Kapsali himself comes from, on his mother's side, he's a Del Medico. So these people it's not just Romaniotes are marrying Romaniotes and Ashkenazim are marrying Ashkenazim. Everybody's intermarrying. And so there are pieces of, none of this is in a vacuum. So Romaniote and Ashkenazi and Sephardi and Italiote, all of these kinds of Judaism are actually kind of coming together, and people are melding them in new ways. But in the case of Crete, the community thinks of itself as Romaniote with kind of an Ashkenazi flavor.
Right. So let's talk about the community and its structure. I think that's really something that's very, very interesting, how it was structured, and there was obviously a chief rabbi who Kapsali was, but also was like an elected position. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, Kandus Tabulo or whatever. I'm a bad. You talk about it, do the proper pronunciation. So talk a little bit about the whole community and structure. Yeah. Yeah.
So we pronounce that condestabulo. So it's just the accent is in a different spot, but I think what's really interesting about this community is that, so you use the language of chief rabbi, and that's not language that they would have used. So for them, there is certainly an important, they're generally important rabbis in the community, but usually the rabbi and the condestabula are not the same person. What we're talking about is a community that has certain rights to be semi-autonomous given to them by the Venetian government. So I think this has been talked about in your podcast in the past, but when we think about how Jews lived in the pre-modern period, they were what we tend to be calling corporate. So not corporate in terms of business, but a corporation in its original meaning is some sort of unit, some sort of institution that the secular state has given some amount of rights to. So the Jewish community is given a set of rights to control themselves in certain limited ways. And in return, the community pays taxes to the state as a community. So if you are a member of Crete, of Candia's corporate Jewish institution, which all Jews are, they wouldn't, the Venetian authorities aren't going to come knocking on your door and say, hey, Nachi, where's my taxes? They're going to go to a central figure who's responsible for being this liaison between the state and the Jews. And that's essentially what a condestabulo is. He is the liaison between the state and the Jews. But he's also the leader of the internal Jewish community. So he's both outward facing and a kind of inward facing character. The condestabulo does not need to be the major rabbi of the community. Oftentimes it's actually a layman. Although in Crete, there's an interesting phenomenon where the laymen tend to be pretty learned, not all of them, but a lot of them are. And Kapsali is an interesting character. So I'll just mention, so Eliyahu Kapsali, also known as Elia Kapsali, that's how he's listed in the Latin sources. He's born about 1485. He dies sometime soon after 1550, probably. And he is an interesting character because he's both very squarely the rabbinic halachic leadership authority and also plays the role of the condestabulo, this liaison figure. And he takes both of those roles very seriously. He's the kind of guy who comfortably goes and spends the afternoon with the Duke of Crete, who's the governor, the very, very powerful, important governor of Crete. And he's very proud of this. He in the Taqqanot, he refers to the governor as his beloved friend. So he's very, very much aware of his job as kind of a diplomat, a politician, but he's also very concerned with taking care of his community. Now, so this condestabulo, though, is not making all the decisions himself. He has a council. He has a group of men around him known as chashvanim, who are his assistants. They're the people they're his board. So we can sort of think of this as kind of an executive director, and then he has his board, his executive board all around him. And over time, the structure of this kind of board changes because this community is really self-conscious about making sure that it has a good structure. They really want to make sure that they are organized. And also, they look at the structure of the community, the secular government of Crete, and they actually mimic it. So the Cretan government has a duke, and then it has counselors. And so over time, we end up with a Jewish community structure that looks just like that. They have the Condestabula, who's like the duke, and their structure, their council as kind of the core of this structure. And they get to make certain ordinances for the community. The Venetian government does not let the Jewish corporation do things like take care of crime. If there's a crime, the Venetian government on Crete deals with it. But let's say that there's something civil issues. Jews are allowed to deal with civil issues amongst themselves. They're allowed to take care of their in-house stuff by themselves. We'll talk about more the fact that a lot of Jews decide not to do this. And that's one of the things that makes Crete so interesting. But let me stop there.
Now, just one more thing on the Condestabolo, that position was an elected position, I believe, right? And how often did one get elected? How long did they stay in that position? How did that process work?
That's an excellent question. It seems that it changes over time. Sometimes I'd say the average is about 2 years in office, although some people are elected many more times than once. So Eliyahu Kapsali he doesn't just do a 2-year term. They are definitely elected, but the kinds of elections we're talking about here need the thumbs up of the Venetian government. So we're talking about a community in which a community that's really, really involved with the Venetian government on Crete. They're always in constant conversation. So yes, elected by the top elite of the Jewish community, but they can only choose somebody who the government will approve.
Now, some of the sources that you mentioned that you use, and let's start off with the Taqqanot Candia, the Taqqanos. So those are more before we get to the secular sources and wills. I'm sure other sources that you use. This was published by Hartom and Casuto. I think it's like I said, I was talking to you before. I think it's like 70 something, almost 80 years ago.
Yeah, it was published in the early 40s.
Yeah, it's it's in one volume. If you can find it used, it's obviously a fascinating work. So talk a little bit about Eliyahu Kapsali was the editor, I think, the final editor, I guess.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about these Taqqanos, what's in them, and discuss them.
Absolutely. Okay, so first of all, the genre of Taqqanot is a genre that it comes out of these communities that are given some sort of semi-autonomous power. So they're allowed to make ordinances, laws for the Jewish community, and they're essentially binding on the Jewish community because whatever secular state you're living in, I'm using secular to mean non-Jewish here. So whatever state you're living in basically has given the Jewish community permission to make these rules. So in Crete, what we have are a set of Taqqanot that start in 1228. So in 1228, the leaders of the Jewish community in Crete, and not only in Candia, but Candia is kind of the center here, get together and they make a list of all the most important things that they want their Jewish community to be doing and to fix problems. So obviously the word Taqqanot is related to the word litaken, to fix. So Taqqanot are really meant to address problems, real life practical problems. So these problems could be something as seemingly arbitrary as figuring out how to keep the mikvah clean. So something we don't think about much today, but that's certainly part of these things. Figuring out how to make sure that the food that is declared to be kosher is actually kosher, things like that. Making sure that marriages happen in proper ways with proper witnesses and in ways that meet the needs of the community and meet halacha. So this first set that comes out in 1228 is the basis of a series of Taqqanot that come out every once in a while. In 1363, there's a big reform. Those of you who are aware of the kinds of crises of the Black Death that happened in the late 1340s, 1350s, might realize that any community, Jewish or not, suddenly wakes up at some point once the plague has sort of calmed down in their town, and looks around and realizes that everything has changed. Huge numbers of deaths, just everything has to look different. Obviously, we may be feeling a bit of that in our COVID era lives, but the Black Death makes COVID seem like a common cold. So we're talking about a world that in 1363, these Jews are saying, oh, what are we going to do? How do we reorganize their community in light of what's happened? And so they reform their Taqqanot again, establishing new ways of organizing and running their community. This is really the core of when they organize this structure of the Condestabulo and the Chashvanim. Now, every couple of years, sometimes in big bursts, sometimes with a large hiatus in between, the community will put forth Taqqanot when they see a really big issue. And then over time, what happens is that these all get collected. A lot of them get read out in one, maybe multiple of the shuls in Candia. There are a handful, depending on the time. There are usually about 4 shuls active. And then in the first half of the 16th century, Eliyahu Kapsali realizes that all of these little, pieces of paper need some organization. Kapsali is not just a rabbi and not just a liaison to the secular, to the Cretan government. He's also a very self-conscious historian. So he actually wrote a history of the Ottoman Empire and a history of the Venetians in Hebrew. And so in putting together these Taqqanot, he's very conscious that what he's doing is for posterity. So he puts together these Taqqanot in this very organized way. He writes introductions. He adds a little section on, here are the best condestabulo and all of the coolest stuff that the condestabuli and the best things that they did. So he's very historically minded. And so what we have in this edition are all of these ordinances meant to fix and protect the community, plus this historical framing of Kapsali.
So yeah, that's very interesting. We'll get back to them in a second. I just want to mention, because you mentioned Kapsali again, I don't want to
It's fine, go ahead.
At him, but I think the listeners may be interested to know. So Machon Ofek published his Mea Sha'arim, which is 100 chapters about Kibbutz Ha'im. Quite fascinating work. It's now in 1 volume, not 2. I think his Shuvas are in the Library of Congress, and like you mentioned already, his history work, 3 volumes that was put out by Tel Aviv University Press. I think Selio Rabba, Selio Zut, I don't remember what he called it.
Zuta, there's a lot of humility there.
Yeah, Zuta, he calls it Zuta. So there's a lot of work to me. Again, he's a real fascinating, like you said, he just they wore a lot of different hats in that way. I think he actually learned in yeshiva in Italy, right? I think he went to learn yeshiva.
Both. Yes. So this is actually, he's not the first. This is something very popular in his family. His uncle Moshe Kapsali did something similar. They all went to Ashkenazi yeshiva. So they left the island for at least a couple of years. But Eliyahu Kapsali went to Padua, and then there was a war and some plague, and he went to Venice, and in Padua and in Venice, in each case, he studied in an Ashkenazi yeshiva there before coming back to Crete and taking the reins of the community.
Right. So now back to your book. And to be clear, your book is not about him, but he does make numbers of appearances, and his Taqqanot, and then he edited it all over the book. So that there's plenty of him in the book.
Yes, I would say that Kapsali is my bookend. So I start the book with a walk that he takes in the mid-16th century, because he takes a walk through the city of Candia that helps us actually understand the visuals of the city. And then the end of the book, we come back to him, because the fact that he, and not just him, but also these other members of the Kapsali and the Del Medico family who are philosophers and halachists and people who offer us just an extremely wide worldview, we may ask, where do they come from? Why Crete? Why do so many important people come out of Crete? The book ends with sort of thinking about these guys in their Renaissance context and in the ways that Crete and Crete's sort of Jewish melting pot nature helped produce these guys. So Eliyahu Kapsali is at the beginning of the book. He's at the end of the book. So certainly feel free to skip the center if you want to just get to the Kapsali parts.
Right. Now, about the center, something we should discuss, which is about the Taqqanot, like you mentioned. How do you use this? I mean, how do you and discuss some concrete examples in your book, how you take these and other sources, which you can throw in the other sources here already, the secular sources and others. How do you use that to create a kind of window into the time period, wherever it is that of the sources that you're using, to see what the average lives of the men and the women at the time in the Jewish community was like.
Absolutely. So first of all, we have to realize that Taqqanot, like any other legal sources, are prescriptive. They're there to tell people what to do. And so they prescribe behavior, but they also are written by authors who are very intentionally trying to depict a certain version of society. So Kapsali, as I said, is very conscious about writing for posterity. But the thing is, when you're writing laws to fix a problem, you have to talk about the problem. So just to give you one example, so on the day that Kapsali happens to be walking through the city of Candia, and he talks about this, he talks about his walk. Why is he writing about it? Because he's very upset that the Jewish community doesn't have their own ovens. Basically, you can imagine in a pre-modern setting, people don't want to, they don't really have ovens in their house, especially if your houses are made out of wood. That's a huge fire hazard. So basically, people would make their food and then they would bring it to this central oven. And it was totally accepted in Candia until the mid-6th century. So remember, mid-16th century. Remember, we have our Jews who have been on the island for hundreds and hundreds of years. It never really occurred to anybody that it was a problem for Jews and Christians to put their pies, milchik, fleishik, pork pies, whatever anybody is making, all in the same ovens. And it's not until this day when Kapsali is walking through the city and he gets to the oven and he sees a fight break out. And he sees that this fight is actually a huge chilul Hashem. It desecrates Hashem's name. It makes Jews look terrible. And he's not so worried about the kashrut. He's not so worried about the fact that your cheese pie is next to somebody else's pork pie, but he's much more upset about the chilul Hashem. He's much more upset about the reputation of the Jews taking a hit. And he uses this to explain why he's about to do something quite wild. He builds kosher ovens on his own property. So from this, we start to get a sense of the kind of world of Candia, Jews and Christians living, eating. The eating together we can leave for another conversation, but cooking together, using the same streets, the same ovens. And then something interesting happens. Kapsali builds his kosher ovens and he can't find a Jewish baker. So he hires a non-Jew who he trains. And then he makes a point of coming and checking on the guy to make sure that he's doing everything okay. But so we get this really interesting view of this very mixed life where Jews have been for hundreds of years very comfortable to live cheek and jowl with Christians in all sorts of ways that for us may be very strange and unusual. And then we also hear in this same Taqqanah about all of the women who are at these ovens doing their work, and he's blaming them for really being ignorant and not knowing how to do all of the proper cooking and in proper halachic ways. And so we start to get a hint of women. The thing is, Taqqanot don't talk about women very much. Not a single woman is named, and for the most part, that's because the male authors are trying to protect female reputations. In a pre-modern setting, talking about women, especially using their names, was not something that honorable, good, modest women would want. But for historians, that's miserable. It means we can't find the women. So, and here's where we move away from the Taqqanot. The other bodies of sources that we have from Crete beyond the Taqqanot come from the Venetian colonial government. We have contracts, notarial documents. Notarial documents is another fancy way of saying contracts and wills. We also have court cases. So this is sort of a shocking thing. Even though Jews were allowed to go to kind of the Jewish Beit Din, which did exist, lots and lots of Jews of all levels of society chose to bring their fights against other Jews to the Venetian colonial court. And we have those colonial court records. They're in Latin, they're in miserable handwriting, but we have them. And what we find is that men and women are coming to the courtroom. And in the courtroom, they describe themselves. They describe their own practices, which are, for all intents and purposes, halachic, but they don't think they're doing anything wrong by going to the secular court. It's a normal thing. Everyone's doing it. The rabbis are doing it. So this is this really interesting community in Crete where they're very comfortable using secular, legal, and government institutions. And through that, we're able to see whole other levels of these characters. We have them, we may have certain men written about in the Taqqanot, and then we go and we find whole new visions of them in the secular court. And I'm happy to talk about some examples if that would interest you.
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a condestabulo and a leader of the community named Yosef Messini, who signs his name and on a number of Taqqanot. The Messini family is one of these old Romaniote families. So when we have the name in Taqqanot Candia, we get little bits of information about Yosef Messini. He just seems like, a good standard leader. We move over to the secular sources, and by the time we're done, we find the fact that, one, Messini was a very, very generous man. We have his will. We know about all the money, all the tzedakah that he gave to orphans, to orphan boys for their education, to orphan girls for their marriages. We know about the books that he donated. He wanted to pay for a leader, a teacher, a Jewish teacher, to come in and teach on Crete, and he paid for that in his will. But we also find that he was a bigamist. This may shock you. So obviously, many of us know that, obviously, according to the Torah, a man can have more than one wife, but by the time that we get to the year 1000 in Ashkenaz, bigamy is outlawed. But there are certain cases where it may be considered more acceptable. And what happens is that Joseph Messini's first wife, Chana, comes to the secular court and says, my husband married a second woman. This is not allowed according to Jewish law. I want you to get me alimony. I want you to get me a legal separation and alimony. And Joseph Messini comes to court and he says, yup, I'm a bigamist because I don't have a son and I need an heir. And according to Jewish law that has been practiced around the world, I can do this. And he convinces the court to let him. He basically says, remember, hey, Venetian court, you told us that we Jews are allowed to live according to our own Jewish standards when it comes to marriage and divorce. You promised, now follow through. And what you should do, he says to the court, what you should do is go talk to my first wife, tell her I'll give her her own house. She can live far away from the second wife and we can make it work. And the Venetian court looks at him and says, yep, okay, let's do that. So here we have Joseph Messini, signatory of Taqqanot, not only big philanthropist, but also bigamist who comes to the Venetian court and explains halakha as he understands it. So we have these really interesting kinds of live wires that when we're able to look at multiple sources from multiple angles all together, we get these huge, we open up worlds. I mean, we have a 3-dimensional picture of Joseph Messini, somebody who we would never have really known much about or almost anything about other than having a name.
Right. And it's something else. I mean, if you have other examples, you can say them as well. But something else I'll just wanted to follow up on, you said much earlier, these court records are now in Venice, right? And that's
yes.
Explain how they ended up in Venice today.
Sure. So remember that Venice took over Crete in the early 13th century. And in the years leading up to 1669, when the Ottomans would take over from the Venetians, the Ottomans put a huge siege around the city of Candia. And at some point, the Venetians realized that they were going to lose, and they made a little treaty with the Ottomans and said, okay, you guys are going to come in and take our city, but give us a couple of days to bring our archives back to Venice. The Venetians were extremely bureaucratic. They were, like the Yekis of the, really organized. Sorry, guys. They're really, really organized, really focused on detail and structure, and really cared about their notes. And to this day, they have the Venetian archives are just extraordinary. So they actually brought back all of these materials, not just the legal court cases, but also all of these contract registers. And they managed to make it across the sea. Most of them survived. And nowadays they're, not all of them are in great shape. A lot of them have wormholes or mold, but we managed to have them, and they're all in Venice at the archives, which is right in the city of Venice. And you could, if you find yourself in Venice, you could go visit those archives.
Fascinating. So, I mean, like I said, if you have any other examples, I mean, the book, like I said, there's a number of chapters, and you go and discuss various aspects of the Jewish-Christian relations between the two. And as you already discussed, I mean, there's more in there. They went to the secular courts. They didn't always just go to the Beis Din and other things like that.
Right. And when you say didn't always, we have very few sources about Beit Din. And actually, it's not necessarily that people had to choose either or. One of the interesting things that we know about these kinds of Mediterranean Jewish communities is that they often would do both simultaneously, that you would go and go to the Beit Din, start a case, and then also go to the secular court. This is particularly true about women. So let's say that we have a woman who is unhappy in her marriage. Let's say she's unfortunately being abused, or her husband spent all of her dowry gambling. So these are real cases that we have. It's very likely that this woman is not only trying to go to the secular court because the secular court can't give her a divorce. Remember, I told you that Venice promised to let Jews live according to Jewish standards of marriage and divorce. And the only way to get a get is the traditional way. So women are going to the secular court. So we have, for example, a woman who's the wife of a very prominent doctor, and she comes to the secular court and says, I think he's going to kill me. She's so scared of her husband that the abuse has gotten so bad that she says, you have to do something. I want you to force my husband to give me a legal separation, which is not a divorce. It's just a legal separation as we have today, which involves him being compelled to pay her a stipend, an alimony stipend. It's very possible that at the same time, she's simultaneously going to the Beit Din or to whatever rabbinic channels she has to try to convince the Beit Din to convince her husband to give her a get. But we don't have those sources. So it's very possible that these things are happening simultaneously.
Interesting. So, I mean, I'm trying to see how to frame this. I mean, but more or less, I mean, how do you view this as relevant today to us sitting here? And wherever you're listening to this, I guess we're in the United States, but how do you view this as relevant to view these sources and to view Jewish Candia, Crete, which, like we said, doesn't really exist anymore. And I should mention, I don't know if I guess kind of maybe people are able to infer this. We are mainly discussing here, I guess, 16th century and earlier mainly, right?
Yeah, I mean, the book really focuses on, say, the 14th and 15th centuries. Right. And the stuff that happens before and after is less the core of it, because most of the cases that I'm dealing with are from the 14th and 15th centuries.
Right. I mean, to be clear, the Taqqanot Candia were edited in the 16th century, so everything is from before. So, I mean, how is that? In what way do you view this as relevant to us?
This is a great question. The answers are manifold, but let me offer a few. One, we make a lot of assumptions about what halacha is. We make a lot of assumptions about. A lot of times we think of how we practice halacha, we think of how we read halacha is kind of the way that people have always read halacha. And we look at the ways that these people live their lives. And for a lot of people who I talk to, their first reaction is, this is not possible. If Jews are taking other Jews to court, then they're doing something that was obviously anti-halachic. They were doing something that was forbidden, and that's the beginning and end of it. But we're talking about halachic leaders of the Jewish community who were fine with this. And I'll just give you one example from beyond Crete. So one of the most vocal mouthpieces of this idea that Jews shouldn't go to court against other Jews is Shlomo ibn Adret, the Rashba from Barcelona. But he himself, in a case where he was named the guardian of an orphan, and there was some financial mismanagement, he himself started a case and went to royal court in Barcelona to deal with those issues. So we have to have a really careful understanding of kind of the historical nuance of halacha. So I would say that's one thing. Also, it gives us good insight into the varieties of Judaism that there are. So, there's this idea nowadays, sort of like everybody's either Ashkenazi or Sephardi. and most people are Ashkenazi, at least, in sort of the worlds that a lot of us come from. The fact that there has been a great deal of nuance over time, these Romaniote Jews, there were tons of Romaniote Jews who were extremely, extremely not only numerous, but really kind of prevalent for thousands, maybe 1,000 years, reminds us of the kind of variety of legitimate and interesting and kind of nuanced Judaism that has long been and still can and should be. Also, for those of you, so Nachi and I were talking about law and law school. So those of you who are thinking about law, this is not specific to Judaism, but we tend to think of law as an endpoint, as kind of a hard line. So we think, the law tells you that if you break the law, you have to pay, a fine of $100. Law has never been a hard line. Law is the beginning of negotiation. Law is the beginning point of a conversation that happens. So this is in some ways kind of maybe intuitive to us. So, like if the law says that if you speed, you have to pay $100, well, the cop stops you. He comes to your window and he says, "Oh, I see you have a baby in the back seat. I'm only going to give you a $50 fine." So we understand sort of intuitively that law is an act of negotiation, but I think what the work that I do really shows that the people who are involved in the law, the litigants, are a really important part of kind of creating the end game. So Joseph Mazzini comes to court and he says, "Guys, you need to understand Jewish law." And he is the person who helps frame how the secular court decision is made. So I think it's really important, well, especially living in a modern period where we sort of think we live by the rule of law, to really understand what law is. So I would say my book, on the one hand, is really very much about the nuance of Judaism. It's also really about the nuance of law.
Interesting. And like I said, I will put the link to your book in the show's notes. And I think we were talking, that's actually not the first time that it'll be in one of the show's notes. I think my podcast with Professor Elisheva Kalbach as well, she mentioned it. So it was there.
Yes, that was a very big honor.
So it'll be here. I'll put it in the show's notes as well. And just to finish up, what future projects or books or book are you working on?
Sure. Well, probably too many things on my plate, but I'll just mention two quickly. First of all, the Taqqanot are fascinating, but they have never been translated into English. So one very short bit of the early ones had been translated almost a century ago. But I am working on an edition with a wonderful Hebrew linguist and rabbinicist who I happen to be married to. And we are working on an edition of Taqqanot Candia, which will have a translation and a lot of very important contextual notes in which we'll be able to think about the Taqqanot in light of all of the other information that we know from the other sources. And then another thing that I'm working on, so I mentioned that I sort of came to this project through wills, and I'm really interested in wills as a way of learning about pre-modern Jewish women. So as I said, the Taqqanot and basically all of our rabbinic sources are male and elite, and talking too much about women in these sources are, it's sort of complicated in terms of the mores of pre-modern society. But we have lots of wills written by female testators, women writing wills or having wills written for themselves. So hopefully in the next year or two, you can go to jewishwomenswills.org and you'll start to see an aggregate of wills that were written by and for Jewish women between 600 and 1600. This is a lifetime of work. This is not something that will be done, but as a digital humanities project, it's something that I invite people to get involved in. And if you have a reference to a Jewish woman's will from between the year 600 and 1600, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and it can find its way onto this database.
Amazing. Really, really fascinating. And I will just add one more thing about what you said about the Taqqanot Candia. It's not available in Hebrew, so you can't get it at all. I mean, you can get it, I guess. It's probably available on, I didn't check on
it is. You can get a PDF of it free online, but it's true that the 1942 or 43 edition, the Hartum and Kasuto, is long out of print. And if you're very lucky, you can find yourself a used copy. Sometimes a cheap used copy, sometimes a very expensive used copy. But Yeah, it's time for this. This is the kind of text that graduate students at Hebrew University tell me that they read this. Everybody reads it, but no one does much with it. It's sort of this. It seems sort of out of time and space, and my goal is to really bring this back, center it in time and space in a context.
Really, really, really interesting. Okay, so like I said, I'll put the link to your book in the show's notes, and thank you again for joining me.
This was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.